Hi, I'm at the New York Botanical Garden. Gotta paint some flowers. Let's go. Hi, my name is James Gurney and welcome to Flower Painting in the Wild. Usually when we think of flower painting, we think of bouquets that are cut in a still life or botanical illustration under controlled conditions or just overall views of gardens. But what I want to do in this one is to paint individual flowers in their natural growing setting so that we can kind of see them in context. In this video we'll be using opaque paints, both mainly gouache and cassine. And I'll be taking you through 4 different paintings. A cleome, or a spider plant, one of a daylily, a peony, which is similar to a rose, and finally the wild rose itself in a natural setting. This will be almost more of a landscape painting. So come with me for flower painting in the wild. This is the cleome flower, or the spider flower. It's a very unique structure with a central stalk, kind of oval petals that are separate from that main stalk, and long, thin stigma that stick out from the side. So what I want to do with the painting is just capture that kind of weird geometry in a single painting. And I'm sitting off to the side of a pathway. There'll be some people coming and going, but I'll hopefully be able to concentrate over about a 3-hour period. I'm starting with a brush to define the placement of each of these flowers. I'm using cassine paint. This is a tubed paint, a lot like gouache. It uses milk as a binder, and the difference from gouache is that the surface is sealed when it dries. It won't pick up as much when you re-wet it. I have about 13 colors. White, cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow deep, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, Venetian red, alizarin crimson, raw umber, chromium oxide green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, and black. And now I want to start just dropping a few colors in. This is a light green that represents the color of the stigma and the main stalk, fairly light green. And I don't know exactly where those are. I'm getting the basic character of them, and I can finesse the details later. The paint is still fairly transparent. And I want it transparent so I get some variations. I just want to set some colors up that I can cut around, painting background over foreground. Well, now I can use a more transparent and darker color with a flat synthetic brush, about 3/4 of an inch. I'm working with the brush held sort of vertically and just sort of wiggling it around the outside of the contour to try to pick up the shape of the silhouette, those pointed shapes of the tops of those buds. Once I can lay down the light shapes of the flowers, I'll be able to place all the other elements around them. Let's do this a little faster with time-lapse so you can see how I'm painting the background over the flower itself. I'm going back now to that large round synthetic brush to drop in some dots and areas for the part of the flower you can see through. This cleome flower has kind of an open silhouette. Petals aren't tightly clustered, they're more held out from the center of the stalk. Now the color of the white as it goes into shadow gets bluish. There will be places where these petals will be a bright white, but I want to save that for a little bit later. I try to find a brush that will deliver a similar kind of shape to the forms that I'm painting. Well, Jeanette set me up with this new kind of hat. It's
called a donkey ear hat.
Donkey ear hat. Yeah, it gives you little side flanges like this. Protect your ears from the sun. Isn't that great? Hey man,
I'm laughing at you.
I don't want to get burned. So now the central spike is taking shape, the main vertical structure, and then within that, inside the petals, is this very interesting angular set of struts that hold the petals out from the center. If I can suggest how those work, they're arranged spirally around the central stalk. And then you have these long stigma that go out from the center. And here I can just use a medium-sized round brush, but just drag it lightly over the surface. Casein allows me to get fairly fine lines. Gouache would be even finer. But now let's take another angle and speed up the camera so we can watch how all these thin spider-like forms radiate out from the center. Painting outdoors in the garden under these conditions is a little bit more chaotic than it would be if I was cutting them and bringing them indoors to paint them like a botanical illustration. Not only are they growing and changing, but the light's changing. People are going by around me, asking questions, so I have to refocus again and remember what I was doing. But I like the fact that I'm seeing them in a natural setting with all of the foliage that would be around them and the other plants that surround them. Now I want to set up a stroke for those leaves that's yellower on one side and greener on the other, so that when I lay down that stroke, it'll have a gradation built into it. And then later when I cut back into the shapes of those leaves, that gradation will be going through all the thinner forms. As you can see, when you look at what I'm looking at there, there's a lot of layers of detail, a lot of busy forms that I'm going to have to simplify just to make them paintable and also to make them comprehensible to the viewer. I want to focus mainly on the Cleomia itself and just suggest some of the forms that are farther back in space, something like you'd have in a camera. The wind's blowing quite a bit, but that shouldn't affect me too much. The leaves are compound and palmate. Compound means they have a multiple form rather than being just a single leaf. Palmate is that they're kind of like a hand, fingers of a hand, and they radiate from a point at the base of the leaf. So I'm playing with the brush to try to see how I can suggest that form of the leaf with my brush. I'm still using a big flat, which I navigate into various positions. And now I'm going to move on to some of the other flowers that are surrounding the main one that I painted first. This one back here I want to paint almost out of focus, not necessarily with blurry edges, but more poster-like, simplified. so that you just read its basic silhouette. Again, I'm loading the brush up with some different colors, and I'm using this grayed down bluish white to try to suggest that these petals are in shadow compared to the ones in the foreground. I'm looking for ways to make each of the flowers different from each other and to keep them from being three equal spots, so I added a couple of flowers in the background. Here's the flower that's on the left. It's missing some of the petals. In fact, a few of them have been falling off while I have been painting. But I want to paint the overall light blue shape, or white and shadow shape, and then I can cut in the holes, the transparent holes through it later once that's dry. You can build up a lot of paint texture if you want in casein. Since this is on a panel and on canvas, I can work a little thicker than I might work in a sketchbook, and I don't need to worry about it chipping off. Casein is a more delicate paint than acrylic. It has a weaker emulsion strength, which means that if you were to chip at it or bend the surface a lot, a thick impasto would break off. Now the light travels through that open structure and reaches down and hits some of the petals on the what would normally be the shadow side of the flower. Even as we get closer to white for the parts of the flower that are lit by sunlight, I'm still mixing that white with some pinks or some greens or some yellows. I don't want to go all the way to black or all the way to white. Now you may notice that I'm sitting to do this painting, and that's simply so I can get my eye level down closer to the level of the flower. I switch from area to area. Now I want to work on the leaves and show how those leaves look as they reach out from the plant, like a hand. I'm keeping in mind that the leaves are in perspective too. They're facing up toward the light, and so I'm seeing them more or less edge on. But they're not just growing out to the side of the plant, they're also growing toward me and behind the main stalk, so they encircle the plant. Try to be careful with every stroke, or at least to suggest information with every stroke. By painting around these leaves instead of painting the leaves positively, I can leave that interesting variation of color within the leaf shape. Here I'm using a mixed dark. It's probably something like ultramarine and burnt sienna. And I get a fairly dark, transparent color, but not all the way to black. Now I'm coming back again with opaques, still using that big flat brush. I want to show some forms crossing over in front of the main spike. And we see the dark shapes behind the leaves. But as I add more leaves in front, it'll be hard to tell as you look at the painting whether something was painted by cutting in or painting over the top. Now in a few places the leaves catch direct sunlight, so there'll be patches where the light is brighter than anywhere else. I also want to show some of the leaves at the base that are looking a little bit drier or more wilted than the new ones at the top. In every plant there are a lot of gradations. Gradations within the leaf, gradations in the petals, and gradations within the health of the leaves of the plant. So in other words, there's usually a part of the plant where the leaves are newer and younger, and they're very different in the color and value of the leaves in those areas. And then in the background, I'm using almost like a photographic bokeh effect, where there are blotchy dots that are as if they're out of focus the way a camera would see it. Of course, I can see a lot of detail in those areas, but I want to restrict that and really focus just on the main plants. The intent of this kind of painting is not to make a pretty picture or to make a scientific document, but something kind of in between. To use this moment of observation to try to understand the mysterious structure of something that might be growing right under our nose. What do you do when you have a page in the sketchbook that doesn't work out? Well, that happens from time to time, and what I do is I start by dampening a rag and smushing all of the ink and paint. This is mainly gouache and brush pen. And then using casein, I can create an abstract priming, an underpainting for another picture. Because beyond every bad painting, hopefully, is a good one. So here we are. This is Corinne's garden. And we're just coming in through the gate. Look at this.
Ooh,
Oh, wow.
smell. Hello, Ray.
Now, what do we have here? Are these Asiatics and daylilies?
These are daylilies.
These aren't. These are just regular daylilies. The
Yeah.
Asiatics are like the ones up there,
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
way up there, and the ones that are in there. Those are Asiatics.
okay.
Yeah, that would be,
The
it would be
yard
kind of
kinda rises
front lit,
up.
though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be front lit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the idea of it being more kind of edge lit. Like looking
And the
back
shade,
this
the
way.
colors are more intense.
This is Pardon Me.
Pardon me.
I love the names. It's
Yeah.
like the names of
That's-
racehorses.
That's
That one,
cute.
that's a real neat one.
Yeah.
And that's watermelon time with the
Over there?
center,
Uh-huh.
right?
Wow, that's very cute.
And then what was this one called again? This pinkish one?
Mariska, Mariska.
Okay.
We wanted every plant to be different,
Yeah.
different colors.
Yeah, that's that.
Well, what I want to try to do here is to paint in casein over that primed underpainting and try to find something that lines up more or less with the colors of the underpainting. Using the colored pencil, I draw the basic shapes of the silhouettes of those flowers. And then I choose a basic bunch of colors: cadmium red, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow light, raw sienna, chrome green, and cobalt blue. And then using a big flat brush, I can start blocking in the colors. Meanwhile, Jeanette's over there painting another section of the garden. But this large flat brush is great because it gets in and out of all those little spaces, and I'm using the brush as much as the pencil to draw the shapes. It's a little hard to draw them in line over that busy underpainting, but with a brush I can immediately begin to see if the shapes that I've drawn are more or less correct. This green is going down somewhat transparently because I want to let some of that underpainting color show through. And I'm also not completely covering the underpainting with that green paint. I'm leaving some spaces so we see the blue show through. So what I'm trying to do is to really just focus in on one area of these flowers and to keep my universe finite. And that's not only in terms of the cropping, but also of the depth. I can only really focus on one plane of depth, and I have to let the rest of it go and handle it a lot softer and go for an average value. I'll be able to keep the yellow color in the inner part of the flower, the throat of the flower, and I'll need to shift that yellow color more toward pink in the petals and the sepals, the 6 flower parts. But first, let's take care of this background texture and try to give it some depth to show the long, blade-like foliage that's behind the flowers themselves. Some of them are dried and yellowed, so I can suggest some of that in the background, as if there's some long, dried foliage underneath the flowers. It's also good to have some darker yellows in the background, so it's not all just pink against green, but there are some light yellows and dark yellows and light greens and dark greens mixed in throughout the picture. Here, using this brush, I'm painting in between some of the shapes of the foliage, almost painting the subtracted area seen through the different leaves. The yellow of the throat gradates gradually out to the pink of the petals. I mix a pink and put it on about a 1/2-inch brush and just begin to cover that yellow underpainting with some of the pink color of the flowers. And I'm letting that pink be fairly dark, not too light. I can always lighten it later. If the paint gets too dry, I can add water to it, and that makes the paint go on a little less opaquely, allowing the yellow or the blue of the underpainting to show through some of that pink-colored paint. At this point, I'm thinking about resolving this large abstract shape into individual flowers, and then to resolve each of the flowers into individual structures. Each flower has those 3 inner petals surrounded by 3 outer sepals. The petals have a rather ornate edge, and then a midrib going down the middle. At this point, it helps to think of the brush not just making 2-dimensional strokes on a flat surface, but as if it's following the curvature of those actual forms as they move through space. Each time I develop a section, I try to pick up on some of the opportunities left from the earlier passage, and I try to leave opportunities, leave ideas to pick up on next time around. Those ideas might be a stroke that suggests a curving blade-like leaf or a stem that I might develop and define later. The focus is on the main flowers in the center, but these outer areas are equally important, just to show them as if they're only half formed out of the elements of the main picture. I'm going back and forth between painting the petals of the flowers and painting the foliage behind, because it's good to kind of overlap edges, foreground to background, background to foreground. But all the way along, I'm trying to describe textures. There's a lot of depth with all the layers of the foliage going back in space, and I can't possibly capture all that, so I'm just going to suggest some of it. Once I get a basic middle tone down for all the petals and the sepals, I can mix a slightly darker tone to suggest the veining within them and the long parallel grooves that head outward from the middle and the shadow alongside the midrib. This kind of painting is a whole series of adjustments and corrections, making a statement and then refining it, trying to make it more like the subject, a little more like each time. Starting from the very beginning with the very loose, abstract idea of a light, warm shape in the middle of a cool surrounding. I'm still keeping that motive in mind as I refine these forms. I'm using a fairly large synthetic round brush, which gives me a fairly fine point if I need it, but it also will deliver enough paint, and I use it to alternate between lines and dots. At this point in the picture, my confidence often sinks to a fairly low ebb just because there's so much detail that I'm realizing I can't capture. And I feel completely lost, totally at sea here. There's so much to... In fact, I was looking at this one flower, and I thought it was the one flower, and then I was painting out, and then I realized I was looking at the wrong flower.
That's what happened to me about 3 times.
That's how far gone I am. Oh, look at this with the light on them now. They've got the sunlight shining right on them.
Oh, look at that, they lit up.
Yeah.
Sudden. Get to work, Jim. Look at that.
Yeah, I've only got a second here.
The sun is coming through right now, yeah.
It's amazing how different all they are one from another. I mean, are they from all different parts of the world?
No, not really. They're all hybridized in the United States, and they're easy to hybridize. You know, like to transfer the pollen, and then you close them up.
Yeah.
And you get a different daylily when it blooms again. So there's a bunch of people in the United States. That's what they do.
Yeah.
And they come up with some fabulous colors and shapes, and it's unbelievable.
And are there names for the different parts of the flower, the stamens and pistils? I noticed one of these is longer than all the others.
Well, there's the stamens and there's the pistil or pist. Yeah. And when you hybridize, you take from one and go to the other and rub it in there.
Yeah.
And then close it up. And out of that, you get a seed pod. Then you take the seed pod and you grow it from seed.
And there's nothing that comes in and eats these that you have to defend them against? As long as the fence is up,
If I didn't have the fence, the deer would eat these.
Yeah.
They would eat them right down.
Wow.
Right down.
Has that ever happened?
When we first moved here, we didn't have the fence. And we put the daylilies in, and we had them down by the pond.
Oh, yeah.
Down there, and we tried growing them by the pond. And they kept eating them, so I kept spraying down by the pond. It helped, but it wasn't foolproof. So those are pretty much gone now.
Yeah. These are the last of the daylilies for the summer. At the end of the day, Ray will pinch off the spent blooms from today, and we'll await the blooms, the few that remain, for tomorrow. I was attracted to these flowers because they emphasize the impermanence of life, the beauties that pass for a moment, that challenge us to try to capture them in a sketchbook. Okay, what I want to do is painting in gouache and casein of these peonies, which are really just starting to open up. I have a feeling they're going to open up fast since it's a warm June day. But I want to capture a couple of buds that haven't opened yet, still tight buds, and then a few that are starting to open, and then the one in the center I want to really feature as kind of wide open. I've set up my sketch easel with the diffuser to give me soft light. And I'm looking here at these three ones, the open one and the two buds. The watercolor sketchbook is primed with casein, kind of yellow in the center and blue at the outside edges. This is just a arbitrary underpainting that I had on one of the pages. But it'll be fun to see how that yellow comes through in the final paint mixtures. I'm lightly penciling the layout for the flowers using a water-soluble colored pencil. When I lay washes over that, that will slightly dissolve, but it'll give me another bit of color. Now I'm using casein, cadmium green, cerulean blue, rose red, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow light, raw umber, and cadmium yellow deep. That makes enough colors to paint this subject. And I'll start by mixing some greens using the blue and the yellow and a touch of the cadmium green. I'm using a large flat synthetic brush. And when I paint that over the yellow, it's not completely opaque, so some of the color underneath will show through. The first step here is to draw around or paint around the silhouette of that flower to isolate it in value. And then now I want to indicate some of that reddish or pinkish light that's trapped in between the petals. Here I have an incomplete mixture on the flat brush so that there's more pigment on one side than another. Incomplete mixtures on the brush can be very helpful because they can give you little tiny gradations in the picture. Often a picture should have big gradations from one area to another and little tiny gradations within a stroke. If you mix the paint too much, you get just flat color. Now that yellow I'm going to need to cover up because in the flower itself, those are very pale whitish colors. But I'm working my way up to white, gradually, both by mixing some tones that are a little bit darker than white, and also by mixing it with enough water that I'm not going full-on intense with opacity. If I stop short of my final accents, both my highest value and lowest value colors, and also my brightest intense colors, I can save those strong accents for the very end of the picture. There's a lot of transmitted light through the petals, so there's no real strong light and shadow the way you'd have if you were painting something that was made of plaster. So the light is traveling through all those thin forms. And I think that's one of the things that makes peonies and roses such fun to paint, because of the way the petals transmit the light through subsurface scattering into the entire interior of the flower. It keeps there from being darks anywhere in the flower, but it also concentrates the very little pale amount of color into the cavities when you're looking straight between the petals. That's where you get the strongest color. There is kind of a resemblance between peonies and roses in some respects. When Marco Polo traveled to China, where they're native flowers, he saw them for the first time, and he described peonies as roses as big as cabbages. Another thing they have in common with roses is a beautiful fragrance. Peonies have been used in early America to line the path to the outhouse for that reason. It's also the Indiana state flower, and they come in a lot of colors, every color but blue. I switch now to painting the area around the flower. And I have a much bigger brush than I really need. But I like that because it forces me to think about the stroke and to try to twirl the brush at an angle where I can make a stroke that's going to give me what I want. Using this long synthetic flat, I'm darkening the area around the flower with a dark greenish color. I'm also trying to think of how I can suggest at least the shapes of those leaves that are behind the flower and around it. There are really a lot of values. There's transmitted light that's bright green, and there's bright light bouncing off the top of the leaves. But I don't want to use that full range of values in the foliage because I want to keep it all within a fairly middle to dark range. That way I can feature the lightness of the flowers. What I'm doing here is softening some edges around the flower. I don't want them all to be sharp cutouts. So in some places where the flower goes into shadow, I can soften the edge. If both edges have dried, if the background and the foreground have dried, you can reapply the paint on both sides of an edge and then blend it. With oil, that wouldn't be a problem because it would all stay wet together longer. The wind comes and goes, and as it settles down, I can study a little bit better what's going on with the individual petals. There are so many individual petals clustered around even the wide open flower that I probably can't do a portrait of each one individually. I want to show a bud that's in the process of opening. It has a round outer shape and then a kind of a cupped cluster of densely packed petals on the opening. And I'm starting to paint this now with a bright, cool red with the edge of the brush. That'll give me kind of a base that I can drop some lighter strokes into. I feel what the thing feels like. It's quite densely packed, lots of very thin petals. Here's where a severely limited palette won't serve me well. I need to have a strong chroma, cool red for this. Let's speed things up a little bit so you can watch the basic process. Putting in a variety of greens kind of randomly, some lights and darks, building the other buds in the background. As long as I have a color on the brush, I can drop it into other flowers. And then when that dries, I can go in with some darks again. Now the ants appear a lot on the flowers. Ants are attracted to peonies because they produce a nectar that's specific for ants, and the ants actually help to open the buds. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship going on. Now that this is dried, I can use a transparent glaze to darken the edge of that bud. I can't resist spilling over the page spread and painting a couple of buds on the left-hand side, which just suggests that these flowers kind of continue on beyond the boundaries of the page that I've done their portrait on. Now I have a much finer brush, a small round brush, and I'm just dropping some very thin edges of petals. Well, now I'm on the home stretch and the light's changed a lot, so it's time to wrap up. This is neither a botanical study nor a still life nor a garden painting in the normal sense, but sort of a field portrait or a field study of a group of individual flowers. But there's no substitute for painting them in their actual growth environment and in the actual sunlight. Oh, there you go. Okay, your turn. Artist. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to do a painting of the rose gardens, which are in perfect bloom right now, in Cassine. The rose garden at the New York Botanical Garden is huge, with many different varieties of roses, all different colors. I choose some off to the side a bit that are white and pink, and I'm using a white gessoed board. Can you see okay from where you are?
Yeah.
So that I can work transparently to lay in the colors. I'm using Cassine, but I might as well be painting with acrylic or gouache or oil, because the technique I would use would be really very similar. So if you don't use Cassine, you can still use these same methods as you're painting. The advantage of the whiteboard is that I'm going to get more natural variations while it's in the transparent stage. So I laid a light pink wash over the whole thing, and then I'm breaking that up and defining that a little bit more. By knocking it down in most places below white, I can come back to white with opaques later. The green leafy background I'm grouping together to more or less a single value so that I can concentrate my attention more on the flowers and their smaller forms. But I'm still trying to link those masses together into a larger shape. I can divide up to the smaller petals later. Throughout the 3 hours or so that I'm painting, the flowers are opening up in the summer heat. Some of the ones that started as buds have fully opened by the end of my session. Now, by adding darker colors around the edge of the petals, I can get some accents and define areas, but I want to be careful not to cut out the shapes too much. If I were working in oil, it would be much easier to play with the soft edges. With Cassine or gouache, the tendency is to get a lot of hard edges. The way I try to deal with people passing by, most people just want to take a picture or say a few nice words. I try to reserve 10% of my brain to talk to them and engage with them, but still stay focused as much as possible on the painting.
It's beautiful. It's perfumed. We're right in we're not in the middle. The harpist is in the middle. We are at the gate with the pink roses over the gate. I think there's 3 gates.
I like to go down to some smaller details, like in these spent alliums. They provide a contrast to the size of the shapes on the roses. Now, every time I put down a dark like this and get closer to black, it gives me a little more depth of value. But in order to keep that look in the final painting, I'll need to varnish it at home later when it's dry. Now you can varnish casein with a spray acrylic or with an oil painting varnish, but a lot of people like to leave it with its natural matte finish, especially for a higher key painting. It photographs better, and there's an aesthetic for a matte surfaced painting, especially if you can keep it more to the high key. Painting roses in a garden like this is great fun, and I can see why artists have always loved to paint roses. There's such variety and such interest to the shapes. But there's something in me that wants to go discover roses in their wilder state, their country cousins. So let's do that next. This is the wild rose, which grows alongside roads and ponds here in New York State. I like it because it has a beautiful fragrance in the spring and early summer. And I want to paint a view of this wild rose bush alongside a farm pond, and I'll use gouache. That bar of light coming down is really the appeal of this whole thing. How far are you taking the top of the composition?
That's all just deciding. What I really love, I see it as a vertical, and I really love those trees that are, there's two of them, they're leaning towards each other, and they don't have much lower branches. On the one on the left doesn't have any lower branches for quite a ways. It comes right out of the light backlit leaves of the wild rose.
And I'm doing it as kind of a square composition. And just getting, down to here. But the story really begins the day before in the studio, and I'm doing an underpainting color in the sketchbook. I want to make friends with green, because as you know, if you follow any of my videos, I often have mixed feelings about green. Sometimes I try to clear it off my palette, but this time I'm going to dive into it, into the middle of the world of green. I'm using cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, cadmium green and white, and mixing those together to make an underpainting color which represents that transmitted light color of the light through the leaf. This is something I've just tried recently a few times. I'm always changing my underpainting method, but this underpainting is in casein, and I'll be doing the painting itself in gouache. I chose a place that's really ordinary, and that's nearby to where I live, so I can just walk there. That way I can return to the same spot at the same time of day for maybe 3 days in succession. And if I tried to spend more than 2 or 3 hours in this one spot, the light would change completely. For some reason they're using the dirt road here to drive a bunch of trucks, but usually it's a pretty quiet back road. I'm setting up my tripod easel, the diffuser to cut the direct sunlight, and even worse, the dappled light, which I don't need if I'm painting in gouache. And now I'm going to use the grid viewing system. This is a piece of acrylic sheet that's held onto the easel with a gripper. I have a wooden bar that rests against my cheekbone, and that holds my head in position so that I can trace the exact view. I circled the base of that fence post on the far side to make sure that I keep it in the exact same position. I drew the grid in even squares on the far side of the acrylic sheet using a permanent marker, and I'm using a water-based marker on the near side of the grid. And my goal is to make the scene as accurate as possible. Even though it's infinitely complicated, I want to see if I can get all of the elements of the scene just as they are, just as a camera would see them. This is not as easy as it sounds, even with the aid of this grid. Even if you used photography, those of you who've tried tracing a photo know that a landscape like this doesn't present easy contours to trace, And as the wind blows, all of the lines and contours are shifting constantly. But the thought here is to map out the basic proportions exactly, so I know that I'm on solid ground, so to speak. I know exactly where the foliage is, where the line of the duckweed is, where the far shore is. What I do to transfer the drawing that's on the grid onto my underpainting is I use this template. This has some punch outs, some holes at the intersections, and I can draw the pencil through those holes to create the guidelines, and then just use this piece of cardstock to trace in pencil a corresponding grid onto my paper. Since that grid matches exactly, proportionally, the grid on the acrylic sheet, I now have an exact transcription of the main proportions of the scene. With the traced scene in front of me, I put a piece of white paper behind it so I can make out the lines. And then I'm transferring what's in each square from the acrylic sheet down to the sketchbook page. This is fast. This whole process maybe takes 10 minutes to 15 minutes at the most. And with that line drawing, I can be absolutely sure that that's the scene as I saw it, and I'm not constantly correcting and second-guessing myself. In a scene like this, it's easy to get lost and to just start making up forms and foliage. I really want to make this as true to nature as possible. Here's a comparison between the scene itself as photographed and the drawing. Now here are the colors I am going to start with: titanium white, raw umber, burnt sienna, lemon yellow, permanent green light, viridian, flame red, perylene maroon, brilliant purple, and ultramarine blue. I can mix the black out of the viridian and the perylene maroon, and I can use these other colors, the blues and the warms, against each other. But of course the principal note of the picture is going to be that greenish color of the backlit foliage. The wild rose itself, or the multiflora rose, is a familiar wildflower found along roadsides in the eastern U.S. Each of the flowers has always 5 petals. They could be either white or slightly pink. They were grown as living fences alongside roads, and a lot of them have proliferated to the point that it's regarded as an invasive. It's very hard to get rid of because it's so thorny, and the canes can grow as high as 10 feet. But here I'm starting with the flowers because they won't last long. Those petals will drop off in a few days. So I want to start with those first. The philosophy behind this kind of painting is an old-fashioned one from the 19th century, even before Impressionism. It really goes back to John Ruskin in England and Asher Durand in America. Ruskin advocated that artists should try painting simple, bona fide imitations of nature, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing, rejoicing always in the truth. This isn't just a technical exercise or even an aesthetic one. In fact, the goal is to go beyond conventionalism or the familiar picturesque images that artists normally do and try to meet nature face to face. And the way to do that is to find ordinary subjects that inspire you emotionally. Now I'm reaching down into my paints to pull out some blue because there's an area of water in between the duckweed which is fairly still, and it's reflecting the blue of the sky above me. The darker brownish areas that are reflecting are reflections of the darker trees on the far side of the bank, and that water is also lit by the light of the sun, so it comes up to a brownish color. To put it another way, the surface of the water is like a mirror, an imperfect mirror, because we're not only seeing the reflection of the far shore, we're also looking down through the water, and the purity of that reflection is affected by the fact that light is shining into the water and illuminating some of the debris. So the water itself in between the duckweed is fairly dark, and I'm trying to think how to paint it. The best way to do that seems to be to paint the dark water first and then paint the light dots of the duckweed on top. I'm using the side of the brush here, but if I had an old splayed brush with the bristles going out, that'd be another way I could have handled this. Using gouache, I can build up a little bit of paint texture. And that happens automatically as the mixtures start to dry out a little bit. As it dries on the brush, the texture of the paper really helps because I can just drag it over the surface of the paper, and as it hits the very peaks of the little mountains, it gives me that speckly texture. Even though I'm working smaller than someone doing a large painting like 16 by 20 or 30 by 40 on location, this is only 5 by 8 inches. But even though it's small, there's no reason I can't get just as much detail as someone working much, much larger. It's just a matter of adjusting the module of the brush down to make a smaller detail. It doesn't mean using smaller brushes, though. By using dry brushing, I can get very fine textures that suggest the kinds of textures I'm seeing. With gouache, the dark values will dry quite a lot lighter. So the colors that I see on my palette as wet paint mixtures will inevitably lighten up as they dry out. In a way, that's good because in a scene like this, there's nothing that's really black. As I look into the scene, the darkest thing seems to be the area under the bushes. As that duckweed goes back in space, we get a lot of very fine, almost lines at the top of the picture, and very delicate wavelets that also go back on the far side of the pond. There are some poles on the far side that are reflected in the water. There's a little bit of a breeze coming up, so I put a weight underneath the tripod spreader, the tripod that holds the diffuser, so that doesn't blow over. Now with gouache, I can lay a quick glaze to knock down an area. Here's a semi-transparent shadow color. I have to be careful though with something wet over gouache not to belabor this or it'll pick up the underlayers. But I like those cast shadows that we get in the late morning. Now in that cast shadow area is a dark blue of the sky that's being reflected by the calm spaces of the water. So I mix the blue with some white and some ultramarine. And I don't think I have it dark enough on the spaces between the duckweed. So I can go in there and drop it in. This takes a lot of readjusting because as I go through the day and go through the morning, the relationship of all these areas keeps changing on me. And I kind of have to settle on one phase of light and shadow so that it reads to the viewer. The reason that tone of the water has shifted throughout the painting session is that sometimes it's reflecting the deep blue of the sky, and at other times it's reflecting some clouds that are floating up in the distance. I want to gradate the deep blue color to the lighter blue color a little bit higher up, so I mix an intermediate value and try to blend those with the tip of the brush. This whole area is in shadow, but that shadow lessens as the morning proceeds, and the sunlight swings around to filling the area at the base of the rose bush. Just about anywhere you look in the scene, there's leaves on top of leaves. They're the long canes of the wild rose leaning out over the pond, and then the cattails behind that. Far in the distance, there are willows, and all of them have a definite texture and a definite group of colors. I'm trying to indicate that distance space now, suggesting the light and the shadow areas of each of these masses of foliage, and trying to suggest the general character of each one, because each one does have a different character. The cattails are light lines waving in the wind. So these might be very subtle differences of greens. Part of the key with greens, I think, is to vary them and to get a variety of different kinds of greens, from yellow greens to grayish greens to blue greens, so that it's not all the same. These reaching canes are a real characteristic feature of the multiflora rose. These can actually take root if they reach out from the plant and then touch the ground somewhere else. So that's one of the ways that they spread. The other way is through the seeds that birds eat and distribute around. Well, there the light of the sun is shining through the leaves, and you get that bright yellow-green color. And then where the canes are in shadow, it's a much deeper green. But even when you zoom in the focus, you never really see individual leaves clearly against the background. Usually they're clustered and massed together, and so you have to represent the textures. I like the way John Ruskin talks about this. He says, "The form of a complete leaf is never seen, but a marvelous and quaint confusion, very definite indeed in its evidence of direction of growth and unity of action, but wholly indefinable and inextricable part by any amount of patience. You cannot possibly work it out in facsimile, though you took a 12 months' time to draw a tree, and you must therefore try to discover some mode of execution which will more or less imitate by its own variety and mystery the variety and mystery of nature, without absolute delineation of detail." A good example of this problem is on the left-hand bank, the grassy bank where there are grasses and weeds, some growing, some dead, a mat of dead leaves with the light playing over it. And I have to almost blur my eyes just a little bit to paint some of the detail, but try to suggest the general value and color that's characteristic of that area, and try to paint some of those dark accents underneath the grasses, but not get too carried away. Where I really want to attract the viewer's eye with more detail is farther away, where we have these very, very thin, delicate ripples going off into the distance, and the far fence posts and the cattails. And here I can get down to the very finest details with gouache. Gouache is capable of probably finer detail at any scale than just about any other kind of paint. Jeanette's in the distance, and she's painting a view of the farmyard as well in watercolor, using that diffuser right over her watercolor setup. Now I want to paint these oaks, this branch of oak tree that's coming over from the right-hand side. Here again, you can tell it's an oak from the shape of those leaves, but it's rare to see any single leaf in a clear kind of botany textbook look. Instead, they're grouped together with some patches that are receiving sunlight. And then through the leaves, I'm painting the splashes of the fountain that are keeping the pond free from duckweed. Well, the Canada geese here are coming over. There they are. I've returned back to this spot 4 or 5 times at the same time of day to work on this painting, and the roses have lost their petals in that much time. The geese are getting bigger, the oak is growing, and everything is changing bit by bit. And what I want to do is record that moment of time and capture it forever between the pages of a book.